Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Sunday, February 15th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high on Riverside today is 61.6 degrees, with a low of 47.5 degrees, so expect a mild winter day with comfortable conditions for getting out and about. Coming up, we'll break down why the Department of Homeland Security shutdown is leaving Immigration and Customs Enforcement untouched, while creating major challenges for the Transportation Security Administration and Federal Emergency Management Agency. We'll also investigate the ongoing crisis in Glenn County, where the area's sole hospital stays closed even after federal efforts to reopen it. And don't miss our coverage of other key developments, from local politics to national trends that matter to you. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We're starting this hour with that new partial government shutdown, which hit overnight. It only affects the Department of Homeland Security, but it's already causing confusion. Reporter Ethan Michaels is with us. Ethan, what exactly shut down, and when did this begin?
The funding lapse kicked in just after 12:01 yesterday morning, Saturday, according to Burnham and Fox's Live Now stream. It is a partial shutdown, and it is narrowly focused on Homeland Security for the rest of this fiscal year, which runs through the end of September. The other 11 spending bills for the federal government were already passed after that record 43-day shutdown late last year, so most agencies are open. But inside Homeland Security, places like TSA, FEMA, the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, and the headquarters staff are now operating either without pay or with some people furloughed.
So airports are still screening, the Coast Guard is still sailing, but the money's frozen. Why is this fight focused so tightly on Homeland Security in the first place?
The roots are really in Minneapolis and two deadly incidents earlier this year, during a big enforcement push called Operation Metro Surge. CBS News, Time, and Minnesota outlets like NPR and the Star Tribune all trace the shutdown back to the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy by federal immigration agents in January. Those deaths ignited outrage over how Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Customs and Border Protection, CBP, do their jobs. Democrats have now tied Homeland Security's budget to overhauling both agencies, and that is what has triggered this standoff.
Let's start with the first shooting. What do we know about what happened to Renee Good?
Renee Nicole Macklin Good was 37, a U.S. citizen and a poet, driving in Minneapolis on January 7th. Her SUV ended up stopped sideways on Portland Avenue during a Metro Surge operation, and ICE agent Jonathan Ross approached her. According to bystander video reviewed by CBS and local reporters, her vehicle started moving forward and away from Ross when he fired 3 shots through the driver's side window, killing her. Homeland Security officials and President Donald Trump initially said Ross fired in self-defense, but the Hennepin County medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, and the video appears to undercut the claim that she tried to run him over.
Has there been any independent investigation into her death, or has that stalled?
That is part of why emotions are so raw. NPR and CBS report that Homeland Security insisted the shooting was within policy, and the Justice Department, at least as of late January, declined to open a separate civil rights investigation focused on Renee Good's case. Minnesota officials blasted that decision, seeing it as emblematic of how hard it is to get federal accountability. So for Democrats, her killing has become a symbol of a system they say polices itself and rarely changes.
Then, about 2 weeks later, came the second killing. What happened to Alex Preddy?
On January 24th, Alex Jeffrey Preddy, also 37, an intensive care nurse at the Minneapolis VA and a licensed gun owner, headed downtown to protest Renee Good's death. According to The Guardian and Minnesota outlets, he was filming agents with his phone on Nicollet Avenue and tried to help a woman knocked down by officers. Witness video shows CBP agents pepper spraying him and tackling him. Later, Commander Gregory Bovino claimed Preddy was armed and violently resisted, prompting what he called defensive shots. But CBS and PBS say the footage they examined does not show him pointing his handgun at officers before he was shot, which is why the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division launched a formal investigation at the end of January, alongside a state criminal probe by Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
You mentioned Operation Metro Surge as the backdrop for both shootings. What was that operation, and why are critics calling it systemic, not just two bad incidents?
DHS billed Metro Surge as the largest immigration enforcement operation in U.S. history, rolling out in the Twin Cities in December of last year with aggressive street and home raids. The Guardian and Time report that Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison and UN human rights experts alleged widespread racial profiling, saying agents conducted roving patrols targeting people based largely on appearance and perceived ethnicity. There were also serious concerns about warrants. CBS and NPR describe heavy reliance on internal administrative warrants, essentially pieces of paper signed by supervisors, not judges. A federal judge in Minnesota found that ICE had violated nearly 100 court orders since the start of the year by entering homes without proper judicial authorization, which really fueled calls for reform.
And there's also been a lot of talk about body cameras, or the lack of them. How big is that gap?
It is significant. After the shootings, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem issued a directive for body-worn cameras in Minneapolis deployments. But Time and the Washington Post report that, as of this week, nearly 80% of ICE agents nationwide still do not have cameras. So with two controversial killings, disputed narratives, and almost no footage from the agents themselves, Democrats argue the opacity is built into the system. That has led directly to their push for what they call statutory guardrails in the new Homeland Security funding bill.
Let's talk about those guardrails. What exactly are Democrats demanding be written into this bill before they agree to fund DHS?
Their package is pretty sweeping. According to CBS News and the Washington Post, they want a legal mandate that ICE and CBP agents wear and activate body cameras during public operations, with footage from deadly incidents released within 48 hours. They are also pushing to ban masks and face coverings during raids and protest policing, require judicial warrants for entering homes, and set tighter rules on when agents can fire weapons, including strong limits on shooting at moving vehicles, which directly relates to how Renee Good died. Senate Leader Chuck Schumer and House Leader Hakeem Jeffries have both said they will not vote for a Homeland Security bill that does not lock in those changes.
And beyond cameras and warrants, are there broader accountability pieces in what they're asking for?
Yes, they are trying to change the overall ecosystem of oversight. Democrats want agents to wear visible identification, like last names and badge numbers, not just generic police patches, so communities can know who is on the ground. They also call for an independent investigative body for serious ICE and CBP use of force cases, mandated outside review whenever an agent kills a U.S. citizen, and explicit authority for state attorneys general and local prosecutors to bring criminal cases against federal agents in certain circumstances. Time and The Guardian say Democrats have boiled this down to a slogan, quote, masks off, body cameras on, end quote, to emphasize visibility and traceable accountability.
Republicans and the White House say those demands are unreasonable. How different are they from how ICE and CBP actually operate right now?
The gap is pretty stark. The Washington Post, drawing on Government Accountability Office and Congressional Research Service reports, notes there is no nationwide legal requirement for body cameras, and most agents still do not wear them as a matter of routine. Masks and vague identification are common, justified internally as officer safety measures, and administrative warrants remain a central tool for home entries, backed by a Trump-era memo from May of last year encouraging more aggressive tactics like so-called knock-and-talks. Use of force rules give agents wide discretion, including firing at moving vehicles when they perceive a threat, and most serious incidents are handled inside Homeland Security or by federal investigators, with little role for states or outside watchdogs.
There's another twist here that makes this shutdown really unusual, and that's this: One Big, Beautiful Bill Act. What is that, and how does it change the picture?
That act, nicknamed OBBBA, is a law President Trump signed on July 4th of last year, formerly Public Law 119-21, and it is crucial to understanding this moment. According to PBS and Time, it gave ICE and CBP roughly $140 to $170 billion in multi-year funding, including about $75 billion for ICE and $65 billion for CBP, available through the end of 2029. The idea was to supercharge detention capacity, add hundreds of miles of border wall, and bankroll large-scale deportation efforts like Operation Metro Surge. Because that money is multi-year, those agencies can keep paying staff and contractors even when the rest of Homeland Security runs out of annual appropriations.
So the shutdown is about reforming ICE and CBP, but they're the ones least affected right now?
Exactly, and that is the paradox multiple outlets highlight. CBO and GAAO analyses, cited by PBS, say that while most of Homeland Security feels typical shutdown pain, ICE and CBP can keep many core functions humming by dipping into that big pre-funded pot. Deportations, border patrols, and enforcement raids do not stop. In many cases, agents still get paid. So Democrats are using a shutdown to pressure agencies whose budgets, thanks to that 2025 law, are partially shielded from shutdown pressure, while the brunt falls on other workers.
Let's talk about those workers. How many people inside Homeland Security are actually impacted by this, and in what ways?
Homeland Security is the third largest federal department, with around 260,000 to 272,000 employees covered by this year's appropriations, according to Time and Government Executive. Shutdown plans say roughly 9 in 10 are classified as essential or accepted, meaning more than 249,000 people have to keep working without pay as long as the shutdown lasts. The remaining 8 to 9%, on the order of 23,000 employees, are furloughed and told not to report at all. Planning documents suggest the first missed paychecks for many of them will hit around the first week of March if Congress does not act before then.
Let's bring that down to the agencies people interact with most. What does this mean right now for folks flying, for disaster areas, and for the Coast Guard?
For air travel, CBS and Fox report that about 95% of TSA's roughly 61,000 workers are deemed essential, so airport screening continues. But officers are already working on the promise of back pay, not current paychecks. During that 43-day shutdown last year, TSA saw a wave of so-called sick-outs as unpaid staff stayed home or picked up side jobs, leading to long lines and some flight delays. And officials warn that if this shutdown stretches into March, those patterns could reappear. FEMA can still respond to life-threatening emergencies like a major hurricane or wildfire, but the Washington Post says non-emergency work, such as reimbursing states for past disasters and funding long-term mitigation projects, is being scaled back or delayed, which hits local budgets. And then there is the Coast Guard. Roughly 56,000 active-duty members are still sailing and guarding ports without pay, because unlike other armed services funded through the Pentagon, they sit under Homeland Security, so their paychecks are frozen until this gets resolved.
And what about the Secret Service and those cybersecurity or headquarters functions we do not see every day?
Secret Service protection for the president, the vice president, and other top officials continues, but those agents are also working without pay for now. Cybersecurity and infrastructure protection programs are being trimmed or put on hold, as are many administrative offices at Homeland Security headquarters. Time and Government Executive note that furloughing support staff while keeping frontline operations running tends to create backlogs in everything from payroll processing to training and equipment purchasing. Over a few weeks, that is frustrating. Over months, it can start to erode effectiveness and morale.
Politically, this is an ugly standoff. How are Democrats framing their position, especially after those Minneapolis shootings?
Democrats say they are doing their constitutional job by tying funding to reforms. In a statement yesterday, Congresswoman Emilia Sykes from Ohio, citing her work on the House Homeland Security Committee, said Congress has a dual obligation to fund the government and ensure agencies respect constitutional rights, and she rejected what she called a blank check for ICE. Bernama and Time quote Hakeem Jeffries saying ICE must be, quote, dramatically reformed, period, full stop, end quote. And Schumer has echoed that they will not extend the status quo while ICE operates, in his words, with impunity. They argue their conditions on warrants, cameras, and force are basic guardrails, not radical micromanagement, and that failing to act after Renee Good and Alex Preddy were killed would amount to looking the other way.
And on the other side, what are Republicans and the Trump administration saying to justify letting this drag on?
Republicans say Democrats are overreaching. The Washington Post reports that President Trump has repeatedly praised ICE and CBP, saying officers have, quote, done a great job, end quote, and accusing Democrats of being radical left lunatics who are making cities unsafe by tying the hands of law enforcement. Senate Majority Leader John Thune has called the White House offer fair and says a deal is reachable if Democrats scale back, but he accuses them of using TSA officers, Coast Guard sailors, and FEMA staff as leverage to pass changes they could not get through as standalone bills. In their view, this is a debate about how much Congress should micromanage on-the-ground tactics, not about whether the agencies are lawless.
Given those hardened positions, where do negotiations actually stand as of this morning, and how long might this last?
As of today, talks are basically on ice. CBS and Time report that the Senate tried and failed to advance a Homeland Security funding bill on Thursday, February 12th, after Democrats filibustered it for lacking reforms, and then lawmakers in both chambers left town for the President's Day recess, not scheduled back until around February 23rd. There is no vote on the calendar before then, making it very likely this partial shutdown runs at least through late February. Schumer says Democrats are available to negotiate around the clock, but he accuses the administration of being unserious about reform, while Thune insists Democrats are the ones who need to drop what he calls maximalist demands.
Given that ICE and CBP are insulated by that big 2025 funding law, does the White House really feel any urgency to cut a deal?
That is the critical dynamic. Because the One Big Beautiful Bill Act lets ICE and CBP keep paying many of their people and carrying out high-profile enforcement, the administration's core immigration agenda is not under immediate financial threat. Time and PBS note that removes a big piece of leverage that shutdowns usually provide. Instead, the most immediate hardship falls on workers and services that had nothing to do with Operation Metro Surge, which deepens Democratic anger and may shift public opinion as frustration over unpaid TSA officers and Coast Guard families grows.
So in the end, we have a shutdown triggered by anger over ICE and CBP, but the people really feeling it today are TSA screeners, Coast Guard crews, FEMA staff, and Secret Service agents. Ethan, thanks for walking us through all of that. Glenn County in Northern California is going on almost 5 months without a hospital, even though Congress just fixed the rule that helped shut it down. Reporter Chloe is with us to walk through how that happened and what comes next. Chloe, what does life look like in Glenn County right now?
It is pretty stark, Grace. Cal Matters and North State Public Radio say the county of about 28,000 people has no hospital at all since Glenn Medical Center in Willows closed its emergency room and beds on September 30th of last year. Ambulances now drive 40 to 60 minutes to hospitals in neighboring counties, often on rural roads that flood or get cut off by fires or highway closures. With only 2 ambulances in the whole county, EMS leaders told Cal Matters and EMS One that rigs are often tied up on long transports, leaving big gaps in local coverage. Outpatient clinics are still open, but officials quoted by Cal Matters and minespr.org say the county has become a, quote, healthcare desert, end quote.
Why did that one small hospital matter so much to the county's healthcare system?
Glenn Medical Center was it. There was no backup. For decades, it provided round-the-clock emergency care and basic inpatient beds, the kind of things you take for granted in most communities. Financially, its survival depended on a special Medicare label called Critical Access Hospital Status, something Cal Matters and Becker's Hospital Review explain was created to keep tiny rural hospitals from going under. That designation let Glenn bill Medicare at about 101% of its costs, instead of the lower flat rates most hospitals get, and that extra money was essentially its lifeline.
So how did a fight over mileage end up pulling that lifeline away?
The trouble started when federal officials at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services rechecked distances after a pandemic pause. For years, Glenn had been treated as more than 35 miles from the next hospital in Colusa, which is what the law requires for that critical access status. But last spring, around April 2025, CMS used modern mapping tools, what local leaders described to Cal Matters and SF Gate as basically Google Maps, and found a narrow back road that cut the distance to roughly 32.5 miles. Even though local EMS said that shortcut frequently floods and is not the route ambulances actually use, CMS decided that was now the, quote, shortest driving route, end quote, and, under the statute, Glenn no longer qualified.
Did local officials just accept that, or did they try to push back?
They fought it hard. CalMatters reports hospital leaders and county officials flew to Washington, D.C. over the summer to plead with the Department of Health and Human Services and CMS, arguing that no new hospital had opened. The only thing that changed was how someone drew the map, and that the back road is not reliably passable. But CMS told them its hands were tied by the exact 35-mile language in federal law and its own rules about the shortest route, and it refused to grant a waiver. The agency suggested the hospital look at other Medicare categories, like rural emergency hospital status. But Beckers notes those options did not work financially for Glenn, especially because its aging operating room could not meet the standards those designations require.
It sounds like the technical rule was the trigger, but was the hospital already shaky before that?
Very much so. According to state financial filings summarized by CalMatters and EMS1, Glenn Medical Center had been operating in the red for years, even with that extra critical access money. There was no cushion to reinvest in the building. The California Department of Public Health once cited the hospital for an immediate jeopardy violation back in 2013, with a $50,000 fine after serious safety lapses put a patient at risk, and surveys described the facility as dated and dependent on grandfathered code exemptions. By the time the for-profit operator American Advanced Management took over in 2017, it was already a distressed property, and Beckers reports AAM itself logged more than $22 million in losses across its hospital network in 2021 and 2022, limiting how much it could subsidize Glenn.
Once the federal money vanished, how quickly did things unravel on the ground?
Almost immediately. CalMatters and Beckers both report that losing critical access status wiped out roughly 40% of Glenn's annual net revenue, taking a roughly $28 million budget and punching a huge hole in it overnight. AAM told reporters it simply could not keep absorbing those losses, and on September 30th, 2025, the hospital shut down inpatient care and the emergency room. The parent company kept some clinics open, but North State Public Radio notes that residents needing emergency or overnight care are now all leaving the county, while about 150 former hospital workers have either lost jobs or scattered to other towns.
That's when the politics really kicked in. How did this local fight in a farm county end up on Congress's agenda?
Glenn's closure became a symbol. CalMatters described how Republican Congressman Doug LaMalfa, who represented the area, teamed up with Democrat Adam Schiff, then in the House and now a senator, to push what they called the Rural Hospital Fairness Act. Their idea, echoed in congressional summaries on House.gov and in Becker's coverage, was to protect rural hospitals that had been granted critical access status before 2002 under an older, necessary provider, standard from being remeasured with new mapping software decades later. So they wrote language saying, in effect, if you were a critical access hospital as of January 1, 2024, and you got that status before 2002, the 35-mile rule can be waived and you are re-grandfathered in.
And that fix actually passed earlier this month, right as we headed into this weekend. What did it change specifically for Glenn?
It did. A key piece of that rural hospital fairness language ended up in a broader federal funding package signed earlier this month, and around February 5th, CMS formally restored Glenn Medical Center's critical access designation under the new law. That means, on paper, if and when the hospital reopens, it can again bill Medicare at 101% of its costs, which is crucial in such a small, low-income market. CalMatters points out that several other rural hospitals in Northern California, Idaho, and Mississippi that were nervously watching their own mileage audits also got relief from that same provision. But the big catch, as CalMatters stressed in a story yesterday, is that fixing the designation does not magically unlock the front doors.
So if the Medicare status is back, what's actually keeping the doors locked in Willows today?
Two main things: the building itself and the money. Because Glen completely closed its inpatient and emergency services last fall, it lost some of the grandfathered exemptions it had under California's health facility codes, according to CalMatters and Beckers. To get its state license back, the hospital now has to meet current seismic, fire safety, and accessibility standards, which means serious structural, electrical, and life safety upgrades, not just plugging machines back in. And reporters who have seen internal estimates say repairs and startup operations together could easily run into the tens of millions of dollars.
Let's talk about that price tag. How much money are we really talking about to bring this place back?
Hospital Administrator Lauren Still has told CalMatters and North State Public Radio that they are looking at somewhere between $40 and $50 million just to reopen responsibly. That figure includes renovating critical infrastructure, hiring and training enough staff, and covering roughly a year of operating losses until Medicare and Medi-Cal payments stabilize. Some assessments put the renovation cost alone in the $30 to $50 million range because the building is about 75 years old. And Still has said a complete teardown and rebuild for a modern small hospital could easily reach $100 million, which might actually be more cost-effective long-term than constantly patching the old structure.
Even if the building is fixed, you still need people. What are they facing on staffing and licensing?
The workforce piece is huge. Many of the nurses, doctors, and support staff took jobs in Chico, Colusa, or even farther away once Glen shut down, and CalMatters quotes experts saying recruiting them back to a rural, high-poverty county with no functioning hospital will take time. Beckers and EMS One both note that even with money in hand, it could be 12 to 18 months to hire and onboard enough clinicians, reopen essential departments, and pass all the state and federal inspections. Yesterday, February 14th, hospital management took the first formal step by filing paperwork with the California Department of Public Health to begin restoring their license, but that process itself involves multiple surveys and plan approvals.
With needs that big, where could Glen realistically find $40 or $50 million?
Attention has shifted to Sacramento. As CalMatters and the Los Angeles Times have reported, California created a distressed hospital loan program after several facilities teetered during the pandemic, and that program loaned about $57 million to Madera Community Hospital, which was Madera County's only hospital, allowing it to reopen last March after more than a year closed. The same operator, American Advanced Management, now runs Madera and is positioning Glen as the next candidate for state support. Glen's leaders have been very open, telling CalMatters they cannot move forward without a substantial state loan.
That's where the new bill, Assembly Bill 1923, comes in. What would that do, and where does it stand?
Assemblymember Esmeralda Soria introduced AB 1923 earlier this week on February 12th as an urgency measure to refill that distressed hospital loan program with $300 million. Legislative trackers cited by CalMatters and Beckers say it is expected to get its first hearing in the second half of March, so about a month from now. Glen Medical Center is widely seen as one of the top contenders for a loan if the bill passes, alongside a handful of other rural hospitals under strain. But nothing is guaranteed. State finance officials and lawmakers will have to weigh Glen's plan against other needs and the risk of lending tens of millions to a small, historically fragile facility.
All of this is happening while California is also trying to rein in health costs statewide. How does that bigger fight affect a case like Glen's?
It creates real tension. CalMatters has covered how California's Office of Healthcare Affordability set targets to slow the growth of health spending, and a coalition of hospitals is now suing, arguing those caps could force them to cut staff or services. Consumer advocates and some legislators counter that without limits, hospital prices will keep rising faster than wages and state budgets. Glen's situation sits right in that cross-current. Saving a tiny rural hospital may require tens of millions in public loans at the very moment policymakers are trying to clamp down on overall hospital spending.
Meanwhile, people in Glen County are still getting sick and injured. What are you hearing about the day-to-day impact while everyone waits?
Local officials and residents told CalMatters and meanspr.org that emergency delays are their biggest fear. For strokes, heart attacks, or serious car crashes, that so-called golden hour when fast treatment matters is now often chewed up by 40-minute or longer ambulance rides out of the county. Neighboring hospitals in Colusa and Chico are absorbing Glenn's patients, but the Los Angeles Times and KFF Health News have documented that many rural California hospitals are financially fragile themselves, so there is not a lot of slack in the system. And on top of that, losing roughly 150 relatively good-paying hospital jobs has rippled through a small agricultural economy, hitting local businesses and the county tax base.
Given all those moving pieces, if everything broke Glenn's way, how long before residents might actually see their emergency room back?
Experts quoted by CalMatters, Beckers, and North State Public Radio say, even in a best-case scenario, you are looking at 12 to 18 months from the moment funding is secured to the moment beds and the ER could reopen. That window covers construction work, equipment upgrades, hiring and training staff, and clearing state and federal inspections. Since AB 1923 is only just starting the legislative process, money is not in hand yet, so that clock has not truly started. Realistically, people in Glenn County are bracing for at least another year and likely longer of living without a local hospital.
When you zoom out, what does Glenn County's story tell us about rural hospitals more broadly?
It underscores how fragile the rural safety net has become. Reporting from CalMatters, The Guardian, and others shows that one technical decision about how to measure 35 miles exposed decades of underinvestment, outdated infrastructure, and a business model that only worked because of a special federal subsidy. Congress's fix for that mapping problem was important, and Senator Schiff has called it, quote, the first essential step, end quote, but it does not answer who pays for a $40 or $50 million restart. Glenn County's experience suggests that without more stable long-term funding and infrastructure planning, rural communities will keep bouncing between emergency bailouts and sudden closures.
A complicated mix of policy, money, and real lives on the line. Chloe, thanks for laying it out. Here are some other headlines. Former NPR host David Green is raising the volume in court, suing Google in Santa Clara County Superior Court for allegedly using his archived broadcasts to train the AI co-hosts of its Notebook LM podcast tool. He says the male virtual host copies his cadence, intonation, and even his trademark UHHS, and likes, turning his style into free training data. A forensic AI review cited by his lawyers suggests his voice likely appeared in the model's diet. Google flatly denies that, insisting the voice was created independently and has nothing to do with Green. The suit could set a key precedent on voice rights in the age of generative audio, deciding when a familiar sound becomes protected property instead of open-source speech. In Munich, United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio tried to remix transatlantic ties at the security conference on February 14th, calling America a child of Europe, bound by shared history and faith. The melody was more conciliatory than last year, but the America First rhythm stayed. He urged allies to drop what he called managed decline, embrace a revitalized civilizational alliance, and reject the dangerous delusion of borderless globalization. Rubio blasted United Nations paralysis over Gaza and Ukraine, yet still drew a standing ovation that organizers called a sigh of relief. Diplomats say it marks a pivot to conditional partnership, pressing Europe to shoulder more of the burden if it wants to keep the security band together. A vast document dump under the Epstein Files Transparency Act is sending shockwaves from parliaments to boardrooms, with more than 3 million pages fueling resignations and criminal inquiries. In Britain, former Ambassador Peter Mandelson and Royal Andrew Mountbatten Windsor face new police scrutiny over alleged financial misconduct and security breaches. Corporate fallout and French investigations are mounting as well, while United States prosecutors follow potential money trails between Jeffrey Epstein and the Clinton Global Initiative. Commentators say the saga has shifted from one abuser to a wider elite privilege apparatus, tightening pressure on leaders including King Charles III and Prime Minister Keir Starmer to show clear distance from old networks and offshore favors. Above the arguments, NASA's Crew 12 mission has docked with the International Space Station after a 34-hour flight from Florida. The SpaceX Dragon capsule Freedom arrived on Saturday, February 14th, carrying an international quartet of astronauts and cosmonauts and restoring the orbiting lab to a full 7-person crew after an earlier medical evacuation. Over roughly 8 months, they will study food production and bacterial behavior in microgravity to support future Moon and Mars journeys, and they notched a first by launching from Cape Canaveral's Space Launch Complex 40 rather than storied Pad 39A. In space, at least, the partnership remains fully booked. And in Gaza, a different kind of critical condition is unfolding at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, where Doctors Without Borders has suspended most non-essential services. The group cites unacceptable acts, including masked gunmen and suspected weapons movement inside the compound, and has pulled back from pediatric, maternity, neonatal, and burn units while keeping trauma and surgical care. Hospital officials insist the gunmen are civilian police protecting the wards and call the accusations factually incorrect and irresponsible. Aid agencies warn the move will be catastrophic for one of Gaza's last functioning hospitals, turning a fragile ceasefire into a ward-level crisis and highlighting how hard it is to keep medicine neutral when every corridor is a front line. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT 5.1, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.